Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our third day of the Polimi PhD Summer School titled More Than Human Futures. This is the third day for us working together on this topic. Welcome to our PhD students and also to the general public who is joining us for the keynote speeches of Laura Forlano and Jonathan Chapman, who will discuss this topic, offering a specific perspective based on their research interest and research experiences. The first speeches, the first opening will be by Laura Forlano, who is a sort of official faculty member for us right now, because this is the third time she's joining our PhD Summer School. Laura is a visiting researcher fellow at the Digital Life Initiative at Cornell Tech in New York City, and also faculty associate at the Beckman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. She is beyond, among the many things, social scientist and design researcher, and currently she's an associate professor of design at the Institute of Design and an affiliated faculty at the College of Architecture at the Illinois Institute of Technology. So I leave her the stage to talk a little bit more about the idea of situate the knowledge in these futures where we have not just humans, but more than humans, entities and agency. And then Jonathan will follow her. Thank you very much, both, for being here today.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, can you see my title slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. I cannot see you while I'm doing this, so just to keep in mind. So the title of my talk today is Design's Intimacies, and I'm going to apply some of the ideas that I presented the other day in the design philosophy talks and things I've written about to a specific case that's a project that I'm working on. So if you remember, I'm Laura Forlano. I go by she, her pronouns. I identify as white, middle class, highly educated, living with a disability, privileged, Italian American. I think I'm human, but I also write from the perspective of the disabled cyborg. And I work at the Institute of Design at IIT, which was founded in 1937 by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy of the Bauhaus School, which is why our school was known as the New Bauhaus. And we're very interested, of course, in the Bauhaus, the early history around mass production, technology, and improving human life. So my work is very interdisciplinary across design, science and technology studies, and to some extent, critical social computing and HCI. It's multi-scalar. I've worked on topics including smart cities, distributed design, the future of work, computational fashion, and network medical devices, which I'm going to tell you about today. It's also really multimodal, and I've worked on both qualitative research projects using ethnographic observation and interviews, but I've also collaborated with designers of all kinds, including architects and fashion designers, on games and prototypes and exhibitions and zines and garments and videos and over 15 participatory engagement and participatory design workshops. And it's very much part of the inventive turn. And I see that as the ways in which social scientists have now gotten very interested in the kinds of work that we design researchers do. In particular, these ideas around speculative fabulation and experiential futures, critical making, and today what I'll talk about is autoethnographic work as inventive and creative in itself. So how do we design in the face of immense technological and planetary uncertainty? When there's no turning back and there's no guarantees, everything must be redesigned, starting with ourselves. And I quote here from Arundhati Roy's article in the Financial Times. She said, last year, nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. this one's no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. So here's a selection of the books that I've edited. In particular, I'll mention, each of these books is for different fields that I talked about. So the first one really is more in the HCI, digital technology space. The second, digital STS, is really more in the science and technology studies area. And the Bauhaus Future is really dedicated to thinking about design and sort of where we're going as a field. And we asked the question in that project, what would keep the Bauhaus up at night if it were practicing today? So we're really interested in exploring the kinds of experimental practices that are maybe lesser known within the Bauhaus history, because the Bauhaus is so known for modernist, simplicity and also, making products for mass production, and trying to uncover some of the work that women were doing in the Bauhaus, and looking at narratives about the African American sort of work in the United States, like reflecting on what it means to think about race, and to think about ability, and some of these questions I'll talk about today. So with that, I'll turn to the new project, and it is a book project, and I see it very much as a work of kind of creative nonfiction, is sort of the way I'm starting to think about it. And I'll read a short passage from that project. This is not a research project that I chose, but rather one that landed on me in 2011 when I learned I was type 1 diabetic. So it was about exactly 10 years this year. It's a roundabout, a detour, a change of plans, but at the same time, one research questions, theoretical frameworks, methodologies, and projects that I've pursued, as well as what I'm able to do and what I aspire to do in the future. I've been living with a smart medical device, an insulin pump and sensor system, since January 2018. This system helps to regulate and control my blood sugar, allowing me to stay healthy, do my job as a professor, go running more easily, and maybe even someday drive a car again without the fear of frequent, persistent, and sometimes frightening lows. But these health benefits have come with a substantial cost, one that's had a negative impact on my overall well-being. Let me backtrack for a moment to the year 2013, before I adopted the insulin pump and sensor system. At that time, I often woke in the night, drenched in sweat and nearly too weak to get out of bed to get a 15-ounce glass of orange juice from the refrigerator in the kitchen a few steps away, or even to reach for chalky glucose tablets sitting on the nightstand. I was living alone with my partner in another city, and so I often went to sleep hoping I would wake up in the morning and not fall into a diabetic coma. While teaching my classes, my face would go numb. While walking down the street, I would suddenly not be able to feel my legs. While the fear of severe lows is a thing of the past in my case, in the past 2 years, due to the need to calibrate the sensor system in order to ensure its continued operation and accuracy, I've not been able to sleep through the night more than a few times a week. It's almost ironic that the system that has nearly eliminated the frequent episodes of extreme low blood sugar that woke me in the middle of the night almost a decade ago has enforced another form of sleep interruption and deprivation. But this one feeds data to the algorithm rather than sugar to the body. While with the current smart system, frequent sleep interruption is such a common occurrence that I'm convinced that I've become sleeping like a sensor in shorter patterns that mimic the system, and even developed a fear of sleeping due to the knowledge that I will likely be awoken a few hours later. So as a writer and researcher, I've described this as post-human subjectivity, and this identity as a disabled cyborg takes on new dimensions as algorithmic agency plays out under my skin as intimate infrastructures that guide my internal processes. So in short, with long-term sleep deprivation leading to anxiety, irritability, and depression, I've come to believe that the AI system that's keeping me alive is also ruining my life. So, and another kind of punchline here is that sensors and humans make very strange bedfellows. So with that, I'm going to talk you through how does this relate to some of the theories I presented and show some of the empirical data, from the project, and hopefully contextualize it a bit. So what are some of the research questions we can ask, based on this case? So we can ask about human technology relations and how those things are changing at the intersection of these smart AI systems and the body. We can ask about how we become accustomed to living with algorithms in everyday life. What are their agencies, materialities, and temporalities? We can think about the ways in which both humans and technologies are disabled, and think about themes such as maintenance, repair, breakdown, failure, and care. And we can think about the politics of these algorithmic actors in everyday life. So as you all know, I'm very interested in, notions about the human, including post-humanism design and the more than human, or what I've written about as decentering the human. And as I mentioned the other day in the design philosophy talks, these draw on a very wide range of theories from various disciplines and perspectives, and each of these has different politics and purposes to it. And I also mentioned that it's necessary to, add this word of caution that there's been a lot of critique that some of these notions are trying to replace the human with a new, philosophy of the more than human or post-human, without necessarily considering the ways in which that becomes a new kind of universalizing and totalizing discourse, and to recognize again that humanism has dehumanized, in particular, Black, Indigenous, disabled people through its history. So that's much of what has meant to define the category of the human has also meant to exclude, and that some of these works, again, drawing on Black studies and critical disability studies, really pay attention to extensions of the human that we might learn from Black creative work, for example, or from the ways in which people with disabilities navigate and imagine the world differently. And I mentioned the other day that, this idea of the more than human turn. So I'm going to, go quickly over the parts that I had already mentioned on Tuesday. But what interests me here is how we can begin to think about some of these ideas as new materials for design. So thinking about autoethnographic narratives and the self, thinking about theories, concepts, and ideas, thinking about AI and nature, and thinking about uncertainty itself as a design material. And I'll just point you to, a couple of references there so that you can take a look at those works, as part of your own projects and your own research. So, the self as a design material, that's clearly, what I'm talking about today. Theory as a design material, I think there's a lot of interest in, how designers can contribute back to theory, how theory emerges in our work, what we might do with it. But not theory just in like a capital T sense, but also theory in everyday life, theory that emerges from everyday life. And I think that the work of bell hooks and Paulo Freire are very clear about this. And despite these works having been written, well, in the case of Pedagogy of the Oppressed was written 50 years ago, I feel like I believe that we've really done very little to collapse those distinctions between theory and practice. And perhaps we do it more than we think in our design work, or even that we do that more as scholars, that we perhaps do collapse those, but we rarely talk about it that way. So there's of course a lot of pressure in university settings to talk about kind of theory with a capital T and separate our lives from that, and speak in a sort of objective tone, and make sure that our work is backed up by evidence, right? But I think what these works show is that those boundaries can be transgressed, as bell hooks writes. So AI as a design material, here are a couple of recent works that really engage with that idea. And I mentioned nature. I had briefly mentioned on Tuesday, and Galloway's More Than Human Lab, and Sven Yakuna's textile farming project. So uncertainty as a design material, I think, which is very relevant to the summer school this year, thinking about the ways in which the future has been socially constructed, which I think Devin Power's On Trend really gives a good account of the futures field itself. And then Scott Smith's How to Future really does talk about how we might design with uncertainty and develop counter narratives to some of the dominant narratives that we encounter as designers. And then Rose Eveleth's Flash Forward, based on the podcast, is actually a series of comic books or comic strips about topics that she then writes analytical essays to kind of explain. But I think that that really starts to move in the direction of, you know, making situations tangible and real through these comics that really start to bring about attention to some of the ethics and politics of the technologies that are referenced here in the book. And I had mentioned Feminist Futures, the need to, you know, have a very situated account and to think about questions like power and overturning kind of binary thinking of Western Enlightenment science. And here I'll add just a word about disability studies. So in disability studies, CRIP is a term that, you know, it was connoted as a derogatory term to think about cripple, but it's sort of been reclaimed in disability studies, and in particular in disability activism also, as a positive, that there can be a positive way to think about disabled lives. And that's a lot of the work that is being done in that field. So we might say that disability is about anticipation. For example, some of my conversations with an STS scholar named Helen Mialet has really experience of diabetes can be thought about as anticipatory. One of the reasons for that is because you have to be constantly negotiating and planning your next move. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, I calibrated my sensor in the middle of the day, and the pump suggested that I administer more insulin because my blood sugar was a bit high. But I was about to take a 20-minute walk, which would have caused my blood sugar to become low. So in this case, the human, you know, becomes a better judge of the situation, and no amount of data about the context is ever going to really solve the problem or satisfy the machine. And so that's why we need to start thinking about, you know, what is that human machine hybrid, you know, as an entity, and how does that allow for this anticipatory navigation of situations? So there's also been a lot of course, for example, in the wearable tech space, there's a lot of kind of glamorization of the cyborg, and, you know, everyone wants to be a cyborg, but no one wants to be a monster. And with disability, you know, one can experience one's own body as monstrous and foreign, but at the same time become comfortable with that machine as part of your body. And in fact, one of the reasons I started this project was because I actually, the tubing of my insulin pump and sensor system kept getting stuck on the knobs of kitchen counters. So I would turn around to get a cup of coffee in the kitchen, and as I was glancing out the window, and I would find that myself pulled, you know, in the opposite direction. And so, you know, there's a bit of a joke here about human, non-human entanglement. For those of you who are familiar with the work of Karen Barat, or really many of the feminist techno-science writing, which uses this concept of entanglement in the way that we rely on others, we rely on the non-human, and that, you know, we're deeply embedded and invested in these relations. But some of the disability scholars and you know, poets and activists that are writing about this have really critiqued this mainstream common use of the word cyborg. And Gillian Weiss, the poet, has talked about the triborg. So for her, anyone that just uses wearable tech and kind of isn't disabled is more of a triborg. So she argues very much against Donna Haraway's reclamation of the cyborg concept in the Cyborg Manifesto, and says that Haraway has omitted or forgotten that these discussions of the cyborg are really drawn from the lives of people with disability who've been adding all kinds of devices and machines to their bodies for decades and throughout history, perhaps, and also relates to the notion of techno-ableism from Ashley Shu, who says that tech companies and medical device companies are constantly selling a promise of kind of a solution to disability. And Liz Jackson has called these disability dongles, which are well-intended, elegant, yet useless solutions to a problem we never knew we had. So another critique there. So to talk a little bit more about that notion of sort of monsters and monstrosity, Riva Lair's book, Golem Girl, she talks about the ways in which the fear of monsters and disabled people stems from the idea that they're contagious. Monsters violate boundaries by biting or oozing or infecting their way past the wall of the self. And in her book, she really reclaims that idea of the monster or the chimera, as a positive, in the same way that the crip term is sort of reclaimed, that one can develop a positive relationship with that. And if we look at the Crip Techno-Science Manifesto by Amy Hamrai and Kelly Frisch, they talk about the ways in which Crip Techno-Science centers the work of disabled people as knowers and makers. It's committed to access as friction, meaning both protesting technologies or protesting situations, but also refusal, some of these concepts. And it's also, Crip Techno-Science is committed to interdependence as a political technology. And lastly, committed to disability justice. And so then if we look at some of the latest discussions, both in the design field, such as Christina Hook's work on designing with the body, but also Lauren Fournier's book on Autotheory, we can say that, Autotheory, autoethnography, first-person research, design biography, soma design, that all of these present new ways of engaging with the self and thinking about our work. And Fournier writes that works that exceed existing genre categories and disciplinary bounds, that flourish in liminal spaces between categories, that reveal the entanglement of research and creation, and that fuse seemingly disparate modes to fresh effect, is sort of what she means by this feminist practice of autotheory. And there are a lot of great examples of autotheory, both in the design field as well as broader social sciences. And I think of Tressie McMillan Cottom's book, Thick, Elizabeth Chin's work, My Life with Things, Mackenzie Wark's Reverse Cowgirl, and Lachlan Jane's Malignant as examples of kind of these autoethnographic accounts and really creative nonfiction about, different topics of life situations. And so one of the things that autoethnography does as a research practice is really kind of collapse the boundary between who is the researcher and who is researched. When you start a work like this, there's a deeply personal significance in finding out the answers to your research questions. And it tends to be very performative, and it resonates strongly with audiences, scholars, and designers. There's a potential to really make an impact on something that might change your own life. Although maybe in very different ways than you might think. And there's an ability to extend theories from the social sciences and humanities through your design practice. So as I mentioned, the storytelling around autoethnographic works tends to be very performative and expressive and theatrical and personal and intimate. Some of the same things that we look for, I think, in good experiential futures work is really evident in autoethnographic work. So now I'm going to show you a little bit of the data from the project. And the evidence is really taken both from autoethnographic vignettes, which are short passages that I write when I'm taking notes about different situations that I've experienced, but also the machine data, the alert and alarm data, the images of the devices, time diaries of sorts, customer service calls, doctor's appointments, participation in conversations and communities online, and secondary literature. And through this writing, I've written about 5 articles on this topic. Most of them are about the previous version of the system, in which I talked about sort of these everyday breakdowns and sort of mismatches. But I about 3 or 4 years ago, when I started using the AI or smart version of the system, which is dynamic, I actually realized that there's a need to continue writing about the topic. I sort of thought I was done with this writing, and then I realized, no, there's actually a lot more to be said. And one of the things that I've created as part of this work is this concept of intimate infrastructures, and I define that as ways in which the body expands out into the world and the world collapses onto the body. So, for example, the continuous glucose monitor, one version of it that I have used over the last 10 years, sends blood sugar data to your loved ones. And that's a way for them to keep in touch or care about you. Or, for example, the delay in supply chain after a hurricane in Puerto Rico in late 2017 that actually caused disruptions in the supply chain and the sensors to be delivered, several weeks late. So these are kind of ways in which I see those kind of multi-scalar entanglements in this particular project. So the danger of intimate algorithms is the only piece I've written so far about the AI system, but that's the one that I'm really interested in exploring, with this latest writing, which I've been doing over the last couple of years. And some of the, and this is an article published in Public Books online, so you can read that. But I want to introduce you to some of the many devices, many designed devices that are relevant to this project. So, test strips and needles, insulin vials and pens, cannula, tubes, blood tests, doctor's visits, acupuncture, glucose tablets, lancet scales, cables, AAA batteries, carrying cases, measuring cups, adhesive surfaces, Xerox copies, nutrition information, sensors, receivers, and transmitters, which I'm focusing a lot about today, lab visits, downloads, Excel spreadsheets, conversion rates, charts, alcohol swabs, and more doctor's visits. And so this latest version of the system that I talked about adopting in early 2018, it's described as the world's first hybrid closed loop system. It actually has several different modes. Manual mode works exactly like the old system. So it's a linear system with preset amounts of insulin to be delivered at various times of day. And then the other mode is called hybrid mode, and that allows the dynamic data from the sensor to tell the pump to suspend the delivery of insulin if you're getting low blood sugar. And then finally, auto mode. And there's a big pressure to get all of the patients to be in auto mode about 80% of the time. So this is a dynamic system in which the preset linear amounts are not relevant, and instead the algorithm is trying to help adjust blood sugar dynamically 24 hours a day. And these are shipped in, what I call these white modernist boxes that contain black boxes of proprietary control. And in fact, I received an email from the company that said that, they deliberately rebranded so that they could look more like Apple devices or Silicon Valley tech companies. And so there's an interesting, I think, marketing message going there that this is, sort of a cutting edge technology if it's packaged in this way. And here you can see what's in the box, which is on the left with a G, that is the transmitter. To the right is a transmitter charger, and on the right of that is the insertion device. And that other thing on the left, I actually don't know what it is, never used it. Anyway, so this is a Guardian Sensor 3 so the sensor is that little translucent part on the end, and the transmitter is the white thing with the G on it. So here I'll show you some of the data. So I spent the month of July in 2019 transcribing the data every day for a month, and just to get a better sense of my experience. So you can see that day 2, there were very few alerts or alarms, just one at 8:35 a.m., calibrate now, which means that you need to take another device, the meter, test your blood sugar, then that data gets sent to the pump and sensor system so that the sensor system can have a benchmark for the reading for your blood sugar. And then day 18, you can see a couple of different kinds of alerts and alarms. High sensor glucose, that means blood sugar is too high. BG required means that you should also test your blood sugar with the meter and send that data. It's like a check on the system. Alert on low, sensor connected, sensor warm up. And then you can see July 27th, all of a sudden, a lot more alerts and alarms, but, even more diverse than the ones I've just said. Low reservoir, low sensor signal, possible signal interference, check connection, calibration not accepted, calibrate now, change sensor. So this is kind of the to show you that the number of alerts and alarms, can be up to and over like 24 per day. So even, more than one per hour sometimes, depending on just what's going on with both your body and the system. So again, that like an entanglement of human and machine becomes really evident as, when you experience the use of this device. Day 32, you can see another, set, other new alarms here, low battery pump, insert battery. So every part of the system, has alerts and alarms to sort of communicate with the human. And in fact, this morning when I was preparing for this talk, one of the things that came to mind was sort of, okay, so maybe this is just a bad design. This is just a bad system, and it just doesn't work well. And there's great evidence that the sensors that this company has sold for several decades have been inferior to those of the competitor. But what came to mind sort of from a more philosophical perspective was really, does living with a bad system make me a bad person? So in what way might that be true or not? And so it's a way, again, to thinking through what does it mean for the human experience of this design. So here you can see the data from the system itself. What's relevant here is the reasons for exiting auto mode. So one is the auto mode is disabled by the user. So ironically, while the goal is to keep people in auto mode, the more and more frustrated or exhausted one becomes with the system, the more likely you are to turn it off. So then both you as a user of the system get less data, and also the company gets less data, and your doctor gets less data because you actually turn it off. And, I was actually even scolded by one of my specialists saying, if you're not going to use the system, maybe you're just not a good user of the system. And, the typical kind of blame the user conversation that's been well documented, from books, including like Don Norman's Design of Everyday Things. Other reasons that we exit auto mode, sometimes if you have too high of blood sugar, it can exit auto mode, or if the algorithm didn't correctly get the data, or if there was no calibration, which happens frequently if it just couldn't calibrate for whatever reason, the calibration wasn't accepted by the system, or the sensor is updating, which tends to happen on the last 2 days of a 7-day cycle. The sensor tries to update. Eventually, you usually get a prompt to change the sensor. So this problem of alert fatigue is actually really well known in many industries, and in the aviation industry. Actually, cockpit technology has been rigorously designed to provide only the highly consequential alerts to pilots, minimizing those minor alerts in order to allow pilots to maintain situation and awareness. However, this has not really been, this practice hasn't really been imported yet into the healthcare technology design field. So really, these alerts and alarms are the only ways that the system can really communicate with you. And there's very little way, almost no way to turn them off. The majority of these alerts and alarms that I mentioned are required as part of the system. You can turn them on to vibrate, but if you don't dismiss them quickly enough, you get a very high-pitched beeping in the middle of the night. So it does wake you up, if you're having low blood sugar, which is the reason for that kind of design. So for me, thinking about this experience and thinking about, some of the sort of discussions about the more than human, for me, it's both the technology and myself that has a disability or is disabled. And this concept of a disabled cyborg allows us to rethink assumptions and claims around technological perfection and the continued dichotomy between human and machine. So it allows for a generative engagement with notions of breakdown, repair, maintenance, and care. And thinking about kind of the biases or harms embedded in AI systems, there's been a lot of recent books about this topic, and I've struggled to figure out, what exact kind of harm are we talking about here, and are any of the existing discussions relevant? So, for example, about facial recognition and policing, there's obviously various degrees of harm that we might talk about with respect to these AI systems. What I would say is that, I've been very much, alerted to the ways in which AI systems are intimately entangled with human life. And I'm alarmed that disabled people continue to be experimental subjects for technological innovation. So there's very much the feeling that, or the practice that it's necessary to send, sort of not well-baked technologies into the world as a way of improving software. And that's, of course, very much true in the software field in general, and that this also applies to medical devices because unlike drugs and pills in the United States, which have to go through clinical trials, medical devices don't go through that same process. So they don't have as a long-term extensive trials to make sure that there aren't any harmful effects. But what happens is if there is a failure or problem that's big enough to need a statement about, the company must then make a statement about that harm which has been discovered by a user and potentially recall devices, so or replace parts as needed. So you get regular announcements from the company about any problems that have occurred that have risen to the level of needing to kind of issue a public statement. And that's how the regulation works here in the United States. So thinking about, how does this allow us to reimagine, human-centered design, which was obviously focused more on the individual human user, users as subjects and users as consumers. And now there's been a push, in the computing field to move towards this idea of human-centered AI. So what they mean by that is really starting to account for ethics and starting to think about the human and not only about the machine. But I think that this is really the wrong approach, because I think theoretically and philosophically, and also based on my own experience, I think a human-centered AI would only result in some of the same problems that we've identified in the design field more broadly, with our over focus on the discrete individual human user. So that's why I advocate for thinking about the more than human, thinking about users as participants and patients as people with knowledge and people with disabilities as having that situated knowledge. And thinking about also the ways that we participate in and repair these technologies on a daily basis in order to allow them to fit with our lives. And so if we go back to, again, that idea of the more than human, one of the interesting perspectives here is that, much of managing diabetes is framed around narratives of the control. And that's, to a great extent, technology and AI in particular has been about prediction and control. And on the other hand, there are lots of really persuasive arguments about living with indeterminacy and living with uncertainty. And here I'll just mention briefly, and I'm not going to read the full quotes, but Anna Singh's work on the mushroom talks about indeterminacy as ephemeral glimmer. Luciana Parisi talks about operators of potentialities, and that AI systems basically are operators of these kind of potential situations. And most recently, Louisa Moore's work from Cloud Ethics on ethico-political beings. And these are all kind of new ways, both as kind of an ethics of thinking about AI and the more than human, and how that might, how we might encounter our design practice differently if we read it through these ideas. So we think about indeterminacy, and then we sort of combine that with this uncertainty, the work that we do in design futures and asking kind of what if questions. I think it suggests this perpetual state of what ifs. And indeed, those who've studied the futures field have talked a lot about the recursivity of kind of futures research. And I think it's interesting to put it in juxtaposition to kind of the AI field. So what if questions that I'm asking, and I think about this as a kind of speculative praxis that tries to integrate theoretical questions with inventive exploration and make sense of things through making futures. And I'll admit that I haven't really gotten to the part of this project that's really, you know, that sort of has moved beyond the description of the everyday and also maybe the intervention in everyday life, but I haven't moved to some kind of design object or you know, use the data in a new way. And so these are the what if questions I'm asking now. And I have experimented a little bit, which I'll show you, but I'm also very curious on the conversation here about, you know, what this research might suggest if I move it more into a design object. So, you know, what if I redesign my life? I kind of do that every day. What if I design new interfaces for the device? What if I use my data to create art objects, such as sculptures and visualizations? And this is something I'm currently working with an artist now on some sculpture projects. And what if disabled people, of course, design their own technologies? What if I participate in and design new communities or social structures? And what if I create new infrastructures? And you'll kind of notice that none of these will actually solve the problem, so to speak, that I live with. And that's partially because, you know, the disabled cyborg does not want to be solved. It's more of a testament to the human experience of living with the systems. And it's a statement about perhaps the kinds of algorithmic harm that we allow. But it's, you know, my interest both as a social scientist and design researcher is really more from a critical frame to engage in the kinds of questions that, you know, that can provide us with interesting ways to think about the future with, you know, maybe biometrics and wearable tech and other kinds of things without necessarily having the impulse to solve the problem today. You know, I like Frida Kahlo because this exhibition and retrospective about her work, it's both about the way that her intimate personal belongings, such as the way she painted on her body cast, for example. She had two severe, you know, events in her life, both getting polio as a child and a train accident that left her body, you know, both disfigured, and she sort of both dresses herself. She's well known for her fashion, and but also the ways that she uses those intimate objects as ways of expressing herself, I think, which is really interesting here. One piece that I've collaborated on with a fashion designer in Chicago, Sky Cubba, is this project Pancreas at the Pool, which is basically coverings for the insulin pump, and it allowed me to think about visibility and invisibility. How willing or comfortable am I with, you know, say going to the beach with this bulky device hanging on my body, and what way, you know, do I want to cover it? And it, so I want to, of course, engage with the crip, you know, notion of really, you know, taking pride in our disability, but at the same time, the complex, you know, feelings around what it feels like to actually do that. Thinking about, you know, people with type 1 diabetes actually kind of hacking their own devices. One thing that there's a really rich community of people that were able to kind of exploit a security flaw in a previous version of these devices to create their own hybrid closed loop systems. And that was done, you know, before the mainstream, you know, companies kind of announced these systems. So there is a community around that. And then let's see, the communities of practice that I've engaged with. So there's actually over several, over 20,000 users in various Facebook groups that I'm on that are talking about their experiences with these devices. And so one thing I've been doing is both sharing my own knowledge about what works and what doesn't work, and offering social support and also mutual aid for these difficult and challenging systems. And the same kinds of events or the same kinds of situations and frustrations tend to come up, on a very regular basis. So this is also one way that I validate my research. So while autoethnographic work is certainly risky and experimental, I think as a scientific praxis, that it's helpful to know that there are, 20,000 people that have, expressed similar interests. And I'm just about to wrap up, hopefully, because I'm getting to the end of my talk and to the end of our time together. But so here are, examples of those patient support groups online. Another group that has really engaged with disability in a sort of positive way is called Sins Invalid, and they've created a coloring book to engage with some of these questions. And this is an image from a project called We Love Like Barnacles, Crypt Lives, and Climate Chaos. So I'll just leave you with, again, what does it mean for us to move towards a more than human way of futuring? And this is really about, again, stating our own positionality and situatedness, thinking about some of these concepts such as the human and technology as truly unstable categories, and they're actually very much co-constructed, thinking about hybridity and thinking again about those questions about responsibility and justice. So what does it mean to make critical futures? Pretty much a recap of what I just said, but moving from this idea of merely users or using, but to this dynamic, experiential living with and making these futures every day. So while I mentioned that I don't necessarily want to solve the problem, for now, I'd settle for an AI system that sleeps through the night. And that concludes my talk. Thank you to all my collaborators and funders for previous research. And you can read more about my work in any of these articles. And I look forward very much to the questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Laura. That's amazing. Thank you for sharing not just the research, but your personal experience, which is definitely very intimate. We would like to have, before the Q&A session, also the speech from Jonathan Chapman, so that together we can have a more comprehensive conversation on the different perspectives of the topic we are discussing today. So here, Jonathan Chapman. Jonathan is acting today in a double role, faculty of our PhD Summer School and also keynote speaker. Is professor and director of doctoral studies at Carnegie Mellon University, the School of Design, which is one of the university which is in our PhD network, and is working on the concept of developing future design leaders. One of his last work focused also on this topic. We remember already meaningful stuff, design that lasts, but also emotionally durable design. Today is gonna open up some of these topics with a perspective connected to futures and the role of us as designer and human being in the post-Anthropocenic time. So thank you, Jonathan, for agreeing to do a double job this week.
All right. Thank you, Chiara. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for having me. And also thank you, Laura, for such an amazing talk. And before I get into this, I'd like to just suggest to everyone in this session that you've no doubt got thoughts and questions that emerged during Laura's talk. So maybe just take a moment to write those down or make a note, because you know how it is. You move from one talk to the next and you kind of the thing that seemed like a pertinent question an hour ago sort of doesn't seem like a pertinent question anymore, but trust me, it is a pertinent question. So just take a moment and capture those thoughts. Okay, and then one other little bit of setup is that I'm probably going to try and speak for more like half an hour, not 45 minutes, and then allow us to expand the Q&A a little bit. I'm also not going to show any slides, and instead I'm going to use the chat and occasionally just drop thoughts in to anchor the discussion as we go. But those things that I'm going to drop in the chat are not critical. They're basically what I said. So what I'd like to do is to invite you, if you wish, to just not look at the screen for half an hour and just listen. You know, you might want to even close your eyes. I don't know. It's entirely up to you. So yeah, so I'm just going to talk for half an hour through some ideas that I think, I guess, relate what I'm interested in with this much bigger idea of more than human futures. So so here we go. Okay, so I mean, the first thing that I'd really like to share is just this idea that human-centered design is the ultimate Freudian slip. It's this kind of, as you all know, a Freudian slip is very much when something you unconsciously believe or feel sort of almost like leaks out through the things you say and do, and through that it exposes a lot about your underlying intentions and motives. And I think human-centered design, I think, there's some incredibly good intention behind that. But I think there's also a darker side to it, which, again, as we know, based on the scope of this summer school, consistently places humans at the center and at the forefront of everything. But this argument has been well discussed over the last couple of days, so I'm not going to go into it as much as I might have done. But maybe the little clause to add to that is that there's good intention behind most things, and I think that whether something was intended well or not, I'm currently, I mean, I sometimes wonder whether it matters that much. I mean, and I would invite everyone in this class to discuss that. I mean, is intent so important? I think of the times when I've hurt somebody's feelings, and my immediate response is, but I didn't mean it that way. It's like, well, is that the point then? And so I think we all know that it's probably both, but nevertheless, I think when we talk about design and sustainability, for example, so much seems to be about intention, and I wonder whether it's as important as we think. I'd like to kind of move on a bit to talk about, just to kind of build on that idea, which is this notion that colonial capitalism kind of flourishes upon the catastrophe of all human and non-human entities. And I've said see Ahmed Ansari because Ahmed was one of my PhD students at Carnegie Mellon, and I mean, I'm not claiming ownership of any of his work. He's someone I've been lucky enough to be associated with. But I think that link between colonialism and capitalism is something that often isn't made forcefully enough. And it is interesting that if you think about the aggressive, just purely extractive model of production and consumption that we live in today, in the linear economy especially, it just has its roots in a worldview that says certain humans can do whatever they want at the expense of everybody else or everything else. And that is deep. That's in the bones of capitalism, and anyone who perpetuates that idea through their work. And of course, as designers, as people connected to or within design, we're in that. We're related to that. But how we're related to that is very much up for discussion, isn't it? Are we related to it because we're fighting to dismantle it, or are we related to it because we're perpetuating it, but now disguised in clever language, which makes it look like we're not? The next idea to just kind of drop in there is that we don't value all human life above all other forms of life, you know. And I think for me, when whenever I see the phrase more than human, and this is also, this is also me learning and figuring things out, right? Because hopefully we're all doing that. But I see this phrase more than human, and it kind of lumps human into one category, and there's human and then there's otherwise, and obviously Laura just beautifully took that idea apart. And I feel similarly that even if we were to assume that human is a category, there's certainly levels, and I think levels in terms of, or groups, in terms of people that seem to be safe and protected and worthy of support, and those that don't, and I think the majority, people that we often describe as the minority, are the majority. If we talk about the billions of people on the planet today, and the minority of those billions of people who are actually doing the damage, then I do wonder sometimes whether claims like human destruction of the natural world, I sometimes wonder whether those claims are valid when you think, is it humans or is it a subset of humans that are doing the damage? And maybe the majority of humans actually aren't doing the damage. But when we talk about the Anthropocene, next item going in the chat, when we talk about the Anthropocene, we sort of blame all of them, don't we? We blame all of us. Oh, it's all of us, isn't it? It's like, no, it's not actually. And so that, for me, I think this idea of more than human necessarily requires a more nuanced distinction of the types of human we're talking about. Otherwise, it feels like a bit of a dead end. And I've just pointed to Catherine Yusuf's absolutely incredible book, A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, which writes on this in a sort of, I think, in a similar way, but through the lens of race in many ways. But it's interesting, nevertheless, to see how the Anthropocene is caused by particular types of people motivated by particular types of things. And sure, it affects everyone and everything, but that doesn't mean to say it's caused by everyone and everything. Also, I mean, I know you don't need to see a book to know about a book, but this book is, I read this, I think I read it in one session. It's the kind of book, and I'm a slow reader, but it's the sort of book if you put aside 3 or 4 hours and some nice coffee, you could probably read that book, because it's so beautifully written. Like if any of you are, looking for an example of what nice writing's like, clean, incredibly deep, but it allows you to apply the cognitive load to the bits that really matter. It's like I would just send you straight there. It's absolutely wonderful. Okay, I just touch on this next idea of negative externalities because, I have a background in industrial design, and a lot of my work and background is sort of doing research and consultancy with, companies like Nike and Puma and Apple and various, the people that are often the source of, the focus of the criticism, people doing the damage and so on. And we use phrases like negative externality, which basically means something that happened that you didn't intend. It's like, oh, when we created this system, we actually didn't intend to create. So for a smartphone, we didn't intend to create 78 kilos of carbon for everyone. That wasn't part of the design. And of course, we all know it was part of the design. It just wasn't part of the design that you intended, or we didn't intend for that village in Madagascar to suddenly move to child prostitution because we shifted the supply chain from there to there. We didn't intend that. And it's like, no, we didn't, but it was nevertheless an externality, and so I think a little bit like my anecdote 20 minutes ago of 15 minutes ago when I said that, when I offend people, I'll often say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. I said, no, but you did do that, that was the effect. So maybe you should reflect on that, and next time do it differently, as a way to try and avoid that. So it's that notion of like this ongoing process of transition where we're all trying to sure, make some mistakes because that's not going to stop. but definitely notice them and own them and try and think about it so that next time you don't do it like that. And in design, I guess we call that iteration, I suppose, but I think it's just it's a kind of common sense of how the process of change might happen. But just to go back to this note I dropped in the chat, negative externalities reveal what lies beyond the scope of concern. And that scope of concern is what I'd really like to focus on from now, and just talk a bit about how do you know if something's within your scope of concern or not within your scope? Like how would you even know? And I was really interested to read Judith Butler's book, The Force of Nonviolence, which talks about grievability, this idea of something that you might grieve for as being almost like the grief is evidence that there was a connection between you and that thing. There was some sort of meaningful association there. And it's very interesting to me when I'm flicking through the news, you know, whether it's on Twitter or whether it's on a news channel or reading a paper or whatever it might be, the things that catch my attention and the things that don't. And if I sort of reflect on why am I concerned about that and not that, it is interesting to wonder about that. But again, it doesn't tend to be because of human and non-human distinctions. It's more about, do I feel an association with that place or those people or that species that I've just learned is nearing extinction, or that particular person that was sent to jail, do I feel anything about that? So for me, that kind of meaningful association is where I think my research and this notion of the more than human really start to feel like they fit together, because so much of my research is about why things matter, like why certain products matter and others not, why we throw away things that still work, and why do we cherish and hold on to things that seem to not have any value at all, but nevertheless they're like irreplaceable. And a lot of my work in design is about that, how you can design things that last, and what are the psychological processes behind that from a user's point of view. So let's now just move into that for the next sort of 10 minutes or so, and then I'll wrap up. So meaningful association, you know, what is it? Well, I would say it's like a consequential tie to anything. And the blank space between any and thing is deliberate. You know, it's like it's between anything, and that thing could be a person, it could be a pet, it could be a country, it could be another planet, it could be an idea. Could be anything, you know, it literally could be anything. And I think so what we're talking about here is consequential ties too. And what I'd like to do to sort of, if you will indulge me, is I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from my new book, which where I talk a bit about a couple of examples of objects that people have developed extraordinarily powerful ties to. And I think actually this follows on hopefully quite nicely from Laura's really rich account of her experience of living with a product or products, and the complex kind of entanglement of meanings and stories around that. Okay, so this is in the second chapter of the book, and I'll share a link in a minute to download that whole chapter if you did want. You know, if you think, oh, that sounds interesting, I wouldn't mind reading the bit that came before and after. I'll share the rest of it. But I'm talking in this bit about object handling sessions, which is something that I do a lot of in my research, where we get groups of people together and they bring their most cherished possessions or their most hated possessions or whatever it might be, and we come together and we talk about these objects. And the power of these sessions is not just, you know, let me talk about my object. The power is actually listening to the other people talk about theirs and noticing actually just how parallel a lot of it is. The object they brought in is different, but often the reasoning or what makes it matter to them is surprisingly transferable, often, not always. So there's some anecdotes from one of those sessions. Okay, here goes. By the way, if we were all in the room together, I would no doubt have this as a printout, and I would pace the room, you know, in like a thoughtful way, probably. but here I am just reading from another screen. Okay. So through these sessions, I've seen thousands of different objects over the years, and it's unpredictable as to what people will choose to bring. For example, I recall at one object handling session, a designer at a global fashion brand brought a white t-shirt, which they purchased at a supermarket. She described how she used to like wearing these cheap t-shirts at home for doing the painting and decorating. Whilst up a ladder painting a ceiling one afternoon, her boyfriend walked in and proposed to her, paintbrush in hand. So the t-shirt now reminds her of that important life moment, but it also reassures her that she's enough, just as she is. Okay, so this story, it sounds like a bit cliche, but it's not. It's a story that someone told. And the important thing for me there was just, you got this thing like this t-shirt, which is probably got ecological and social destruction woven into it. But nevertheless, you've got this thing which somehow made the transition from product to possession. And it did that through having consequential ties now sort of embedded into it in new stories. There's a follow-on example here. Another object story that really stands out in my mind was from a father who brought in a small blanket. Wrapped carefully inside the blanket was a model made out of about a dozen multicolored Lego bricks. We were asked kindly not to touch the Lego model, but were free to look. The small object sat cushioned on its soft blanket while he tearfully recounted the story of his young son's battle with leukemia, a battle the little boy tragically lost. Years later, the dad gathered the strength to go through his son's old toys and give them to friends and family in local charity shops. He told us how, at the center of the Lego box, he found this work-in-progress model. A precious object indeed that connects him powerfully to his son and to a time in his life when he was well enough to play. And so what starts out as a random collection of stuff, you know, these sessions just looks like sometimes it just looks like random things just plonked on a table. But what starts out like that, once you hear the stories and the ties and the connections, very quickly becomes like a museum exhibit featuring some of the most priceless artifacts we have. You know, and it's, you know, it never fails to blow me away, the power of these objects and these stories. So now let's bring this back a little bit to the topic of the summer school more directly. So back in the chat, I've said experiential adjacencies make things matter and in turn evoke care practices. And if we think back to what I said earlier about colonial capitalism and the subjugation and catastrophe of others as being a requirement, and presumably it's part of the reason why that happens is because we don't care. There's no meaningful connection, there's no consequential adjacency there. I want to talk a little bit about to sort of create a context for the final part of this little talk. I want to share something that one of my PhD students shared with me, Hajira Kazi, who said that there are 3 levels of Iman, which means faith in Islam: the heart, the tongue, and the hand. And I'm going to talk a bit about this as a way to create a context that is also about us not saying theory and practice, but instead talks about different ways of thinking about the lived experience of engaging with the world. So the first level, the heart, which is considered the weakest level, is where you feel something. I feel this. And the tongue is where you begin to talk about it and write about it, listen about it. But then, and that's the middle level of faith. And then the final level of faith, the highest level it's considered, is the hand, where you act, you take action and you do something. And so what's interesting about these 3 parts is that they all happen all of the time, but sometimes we tend to spend most time in the heart and some time in the tongue and very little time in the hand quite often. If we think about something like climate change, or what are you doing about the crisis to do, loss of biodiversity? What are you actually doing about that? You might say, well, perhaps not much. What are you saying about that? Maybe quite a bit. And what do you feel about that? It's like, oh, well, how long have you got? So I find that, I don't know, I heard about this literally, I think it was 4 weeks ago. And it really, I found it, deeply fascinating to think of it in those terms. I was driving home from the supermarket 2 days ago, and I drove past a deer that had been hit by a car, but it was still alive. I think it was still alive. And I still feel terrible I didn't stop and do anything. This is me being honest, my opinion, your opinion of me will go down as a result of that probably, but I didn't stop and help it out, as in finish it off. I didn't do that, but I felt something about it. And I even remember coming home and telling my wife about it, but I didn't actually do anything. And the reason I'm kind of exposing myself and sharing this story is because when I reflect on that incident, I think that's like so many situations which we see and we're well aware what's happening and we have feelings about it and we might even talk about it. People like me might even write about it, right? But what are you actually doing about that? So this brings us to scale, I think, and this will be the closing idea of what I'd like to say. And so the idea of scale, I think, is important. And I'm sharing this idea in the chat that more than human practice is a small, everyday, practice-based act. And I wanted you to have a look at Yanni Alexander Lucas's all data are local, which I think is a really interesting idea, that you got this notion of something like data, which I don't know about you, but when I hear that word, I immediately think of a globe, and I think of hugely complex, unfathomably vast networks of information, and suddenly data has everything to do, it has to do with everything apart from me in this room here in my house, whereas I think what this book does is it also flips that and says, yeah, it is that, but it is also you in this room here now, today, in this moment. It's situated, it's place-based, and so on. And so actually, I think when we want to talk, if we want to talk about change and how the heart, the tongue, and the hand, and we want to operate on those different scales, I think the only way that, for me, the only way that I can operate in that way is to take steps in my own life which immediately brings the scale down. I keep trying to push it back out, and then I get into theory again and ideology, and oh, I can write a paper on that, and which is fine, that world exists and it should. But the wider it goes, the less able I feel to act, to actually do anything. And then I bring it back down to me in this room, in this house today, on a Friday. And there are suddenly things I can imagine doing. So I would like to invite us as a group, I mean, maybe there can be some discussion about this, but that notion of practice, personal practice and a professional practice, and whether there's a danger in thinking on vast systems levels, in that it almost places any tangible, practical action out of scope, because in the end, you're one person. And I think there's a really interesting tension there. I don't think it's a contradiction. I think it's just a tension that sometimes we fumble with. And it can wrongly make the small things seem not enough. And it can also wrongly make those big, bold ideas seem really heroic and superb, when actually you could say, well, sure, but I don't really know what difference that makes. So I would like for us to wonder about that a little bit. And then I guess a closing thought, just before I wrap up, is that there's a sort of this idea that it's not, for me, it's not more than human, but it's more than me. As a human, perhaps I should say. Because I think that, you know, I titled this talk The Cage of Anthropocentrism, and the more I think about that, the more I kind of think, well, it's our individuated, inescapable narcissism that is perhaps the thing preventing us from engaging with things beyond ourselves that just don't matter enough for us to sacrifice our comfort for something else, be it human or not. And so I think more than me futures might be interesting. And I also think the idea of a more than me future places it on an individual scale, which each of us has, and which also brings us contextual specificity to our thinking. You know, my me is different to your me. And I also sometimes wonder whether that avoids some of the generalizing and universalizing kind of tactics that design tends to very quickly find itself doing, which strips away all the nuance and difference in people, and then replaces it with a 5-point strategy for change, which makes sense on paper but doesn't really resonate on a personal level with anybody. So I'm gonna kind of leave it there. Some things that I've been thinking about, which I hope relate in some ways to the focus of this summer school, but I also hope complement some of what Laura was talking about, so that we can now have, you know, some responses and a bit of a discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you so much. Thank you both, Laura and Jonathan. I think I'll just talk a bit to give some time because both Stefano and I think wanted to give as much space as possible to students and to people that are listening. So I'll just open up to give them time to maybe find the courage also to come forward. Yeah, so beautiful. I mean, both I don't know if you spoke to each other before this, but they're completely integrated, obviously. And, you know, I want to just take it back, like connect the two and take it back to the scope of concern that you were talking about, Jonathan, and connect it to the beginning of what, Laura, you were talking about, the fact that going back to normality would be the wrong thing to do. And that what keeps designers up at night. I think these two ideas, these two concepts come together beautifully, and especially for people that are doing a PhD, I think it's fundamental, because I feel that sometimes we're so wrapped up into methodology, into understanding what is evidence, what are the design devices, what is measurable, what is not. But we lose the focus of what we care for, which you both focused on, I think, in a very intimate way. And I think it's a moment where we all need to bring this in our research for sure. Sometimes we forget it when we're so, you know, focused on, oh, how am I going to, you know, get this qualitative or quantitative data working, and how is this acceptable in a PhD, and, you know, all these questions. But I think the question on the top is, do I really care for what I'm doing, what my PhD is about? You know, what is this research about? So I just I'll leave this to the others to comment, maybe reflecting on their own research. I just wanted to put in my personal intuition I had listening to Laura on you talked about monsters. So I want to put in a what if question. I want to add a what if question to yours. Monster, when you talked about monster, what came to my mind is one of the constants of there's an Italian designer called Bruno Munari, who wrote a book in 1977 called Fantasia, and one of his methods was called monster making, and it was actually the idea was actually to put together the fusion of two different elements in order to make one body. So maybe my what if is, you know, is connected to the fact that we're so immersed in, you know, control and, as you were saying, also perfection, the idea of perfection. And maybe this monster making could be, you know, not considered a monster anymore, but the monster making will be a new aesthetics, you know, of if we don't think of the human as a human and the other element as another element, but the two together make a new body. So this is what if. I don't know what it takes us to, but it's my what if. Okay, so I'll leave it. I don't know if you have something to say on that. Otherwise, we'll leave the other questions. Or Stefano?
I was
Yeah,
just going to respond quickly. Thank you very much, Valentina. I love that idea. And I think there is a tradition of thinking about, you know, monstrosity. And I think that's what maybe art, you know, maybe more on the art side, but art and design can do really well, is bringing together visual ways that we can't yet define in language, but we might be able to make them visually or physically and then name them later. Like naming our monsters later might provide us those new theoretical concepts that we need to design these kind of more than human.
Exactly. Munari actually referred to art in describing this. So, you know, Dali's woman with the drawers in her stomach, or mermaids, or, you know, Ganesh, all the gods, the Indian gods. I mean, these are all examples that he gave. But what does it mean in design? I don't know, because he didn't come to a conclusion, but could be an inspiration.
Yeah, and I think Frederick Van Emstel's been doing a great talk and paper on monster aesthetics in the Brazilian context, which is also very relevant to this conversation.
Stefano, go ahead. If you have a question, let's just continue the conversation.
Just one minor reflection. Thanks so much, Jonathan and Laura, for such inspiring talks. And in my understanding as science technology studies scholar and sociologist of science, I appreciated a lot your, let's say, intervention to rethink design as a way for overcoming a sort of current necropolitics that characterize our, let's say, capitalist regimes. So I was wondering to which extent design field could be reconfigured as an ontological resistance, in the sense that we could identify potential design approach as a new style of practices for designer. Just to mention, Laura, your last word about the community of practices. Well, as a new style of practice that rather than focusing on traditional representational politics of the users, such as by engaging them in, say, according to the human-centered design, so design could be directly engaged in the remaking the material fabric of urban and metropolitan environment, as well as ordinary setting of interaction. So design could be rethinked as ontological resistance and can identify design practices that operate within the constraint of a given material spaces, and that the primary starting point could be the transformation of the material condition of everyday existence. So from my point of view, the issue at stake here is how we could perform such an ontological resistance, mobilizing design practices outside the epistemic and political boundary of the current capitalism. So the question or a point of reflection, it could be how and to which extent a number of practices such as alternative food growing practices, urban gardens, the caretaking of local ecological system, community feminism, community feminist technoscience, for example, or do-it-yourself technologies, the making movement could be, let's say, hacking practices can contaminate mainstream design for eliciting, say, ordinary tactics of resistance. We don't to codify an alternative ontologies of existence. The idea is to mobilize design, not only metaphorically, but conceptually, pragmatically, to rethink, to redesign maybe the kind of relationship we can establish with humans and non-humans form of life in a material, in a, say, technologically dense society. So just to this is just a quite confusing reflection, but well, this is my perspective.
Could I respond to that, if that's okay? And also, and Stefano, thank you for that, and also Valentina, thank you for your reflections as well. And I'm keen that members of the summer school, or those PhD students out there, kind of think up questions and thoughts as well. And if you, it sometimes feels a bit much actually to raise your hand and do it. So use the chat function if you want, just to pop a question in there. And don't worry about spelling errors or grammar mistakes, because we all make loads of those. So just let's use that as well. But in the meantime, I was just going to say a couple of things. I think in terms of what Valentina just said, and then also Stefano in a minute, the idea of monsters is kind of interesting, because I think once you, beyond what monsters look like, if you think about sort of what a monster is, you realize we've got quite a lot of those. Like, I think about things like Facebook, is that a monster? And I think about, do you know what I'm saying though? It's kind of like, depending on the classification, you suddenly realize that as a frame, a lot of things suddenly appear within it, depending on the what are the parameters for monster, which I think could be kind of interesting. It's something I'm going to be wondering about for the rest of the day now, probably. Thank you for that. And then Stefano, I just wanted to respond to what you said about ontological resistance, and I've been around the word ontology for a couple of decades now, and I still, I get it, but it's still, I feel my brain start to heat up whenever you add ontological with anything else. It sort of uses up all my RAM, and then I'm like, now I can't really think about the other thing. And I can do it, but it takes me time. And hopefully those are words of reassurance to anyone else in the call who struggles with that word. But I know what you mean by it. I think probably superficially, I know what you mean by it. And I think it's maybe just resistance. For me, it's just design as resistance. I don't know whether it's ontological resistance or not. And the reason I say that is because all design, I feel, good and bad, is resisting something. And it's always the most cynical boardrooms I've been in. It's always about, we want it less like this, more like that. So there's always a kind of resistance to a current state, and a craving of a future state. But obviously the values of that transition that's taking place are sometimes not the kinds of values we ought to be promoting. But there's still a transition taking place, and there's still a resistance with current state. So I'm going to pass that back to you, Stefano, not to try and argue, but more to try and say, what do you think about that?
I also want to jump in on that thread. It's I think just to try to connect also some of the comments, is I've been thinking a little bit about, disobedient design. What does that mean? What does that look like? And I think there's a need to look at like dominant narratives, and there's a need to look at alternative narratives, and then there's a need to look at alternative to the alternative narratives. Because if we're really thinking about overcoming like binary ways of thinking, it can't only just be resisting the dominant narrative. It has to either be exploring a wide variety of different perspectives and narratives. And I think it's really our responsibility as designers to know the terrain of ideas from a really wide variety of fields, which is why, even though I can't, I myself don't feel like I can become, an expert on Black studies, but I can know about and attempt to go to as many webinars as I can, read as many books as, and I think I can try to know the terrain so that I can then do a better job of representing what all those different narratives are, and then figure out which ones to engage with. I don't think it's okay to just be ambivalent or ignore them, or just not even be aware, right? So I do think cultivating that kind of where to look for alternative narratives, and that's why I think the field of science and technology studies is so valuable to design, because it does provide some of that, and think about what does it mean to be a kind of disobedient designer. Yeah,
I feel that with respect to that, Laura, if I would like the students to, if there's someone, I'll leave space. I'm very happy to, if someone has a question related to their research, we're very happy to leave the stage, or questions in the chat, please do, so we can give some space to you, because I have many questions. I can go ahead for, and I think the others too. Okay, I'll just link to Laura, and then hopefully someone will raise their hand, even if you just raise it up. Yeah, no, I think one of the risks of that, I mean, not the risks, one of the it's a reflection that I've been having on this, on looking somewhere else, you know, looking in other directions, is that you're always standing in a place, though. I mean, you're always inside your pre-configured, as Jonathan also was saying before, you know, we live this status of where this is the reality we're living now, and you're always, you know, looking at the future, looking at other directions, but always standing from here. So how do we, you know, move our feet in another place to stand in order to look in other directions? Because sometimes the place where I'm standing influences so much what I'm seeing, right? And this, I think, is an interesting reflection we should maybe have on understanding first where I'm standing and what is influencing what I'm seeing, and then being able to move from there in order to see something different, maybe. I don't know if it's possible, but and connected to this, maybe one thing I was listening again to Laura's presentation, what you talked a lot, you said a lot, you used the word alert many times, and that brought to mind the word urgency that we use in design lately. So the fact that, you know, we need to address what is urgent, but I like also the word, maybe instead of urgency, emergency, and I wanted to your reflection on this. So emergency, it means also emergent. So something is, you know, both emergent, but also there's an emergency at the same time. So just on what we think at the moment could be emergent, and at the same time is, you know, something that we need to really address in research, of course, in design. Yeah,
I love that, because thinking about the work of design to be about creating those conceptual, you know, creative concepts. I think we maybe don't pay quite enough attention to that in design education, a real attention to why it matters, whether we use the word urgency, emergency, or emergency, and if we put some maybe parentheses around the EM, and, you know, become something totally different. And I do think that can be about approaching language and theory and writing as part of our design practice, as a creative practice, right? And I know there's been some great workshops over the years. I recall one from the Design Research Society in Brighton that Virginia Tassinari and Nick Burton did about kind of inventing concepts. And I think they were like lab coats, or there was this whole experience of what it means to create new concepts. And I've even tried that in classes where you just kind of cut up existing concepts and then put them together, maybe in the same way as the kind of monsters that we were just talking about, which could be, you know, visual or physical, but you could put them together. And I think learning that, you know, I mean, really experiencing that as a part of design knowledge is like incredibly essential to enrich our dialogue, because I think we often will just use words as placeholders, kind of like the word community is used all the time. Oh, community-based this or that. And it's like, but whose definition of that? And what does it really mean? And how, you know, why do we care about that word versus another word? So I really do strongly believe in that. That's a part of our practice we have to deepen and enrich.
I'd like to add a small bit to that, Laura, if I may. And I also noticed that Manuela has a hand up, so perhaps after I can pass to Manuela. But a bit on scale as well, and that the community made me think about the PhD as well, which of course is something everyone in this session is interested in, I'm assuming. And I also noticed Michael Magis is in the session. So hi, Michael. Michael's one of our graduates from CMU and PhD graduate. And so I wanted to say that there's this pressure, I think, in design PhDs, where the bigger the better, you know, the scale of the problem needs to be vast, which it you know, should be in terms of how we describe it and think about it, perhaps. And the practice itself needs to be vast. And one of the things that I'm keen to explore, and Laura, I don't know about you, because I know you're very involved in the PhD program at IIT, but this idea that maybe a PhD could be incredibly small, but also incredibly specific. You know, it could be about one village in one place only, and that there might be a viable PhD in that. And who's to say, you know, that's not richer and more kind of meaningful than something that makes spurious, massive claims that sound impressive but don't really apply to anything. Like, there's no touch point to that anywhere in the world. So I don't know, it's something we're kind of exploring, whether it's, you know, as design does become more nuanced and starts to break away from this globalized idea of what design is, we might want to also think about how the PhD itself needs to sort of mirror that, create space for smaller, more nuanced work.
There's Manuela, and we have a chat question. So go ahead, Manuela, and then I think.
Thank you, Jonathan and Laura, for your very insightful presentations, or talk, better to say, Jonathan. Laura, I had the chance to meet you already in an event with Oscar for the Fuel for Design project in which I'm involved. So I just want to frame this question inside the fact that I'm a lot interested in the use of anticipation inside the design practice. And I have to underline that even if anticipation is a sort of embedded into design, and even if most the designers don't really recognize these already embedded projections into the future that our activity already has. But we have also to underline that anticipation is not only ours. I mean, anticipation is inside nature. There are a lot of animals, there are a lot of vegetables that are proved to be able to anticipate what is going to happen. So it's very interesting a kind of concept, and it's also, I have to say, very distant from the strategic perspective, because strategy means to put together what you have at hand right now and to exploit it in the better way. Why to anticipate is to try to imagine what you can do apart from what you already have, and what might happen instead, or what might happen of different, out of the normal, and also to foresee that perspective. So in your speech, Laura, there were connected to anticipation. There was also the two ideas. The one of the well, there were a lot of ideas, but I see a lot of connection also in the speech around the self as design material and the idea of autoethnography. My question is how we can bring together those two elements of self and autoethnography methodologically to understand and design what comes next. And that's the first part of my question. And the second one, maybe it's more provocative. I'm wondering, but if we use a self as design material, and if we use an autoethnography as a kind of perspective, are then we really able to produce something that is more than human from this perspective?
Thank you. Those are both great questions. I'm just trying to note them down a bit. I mean, so I think and I've learned a lot also from working with Oscar Tomiko at Elisava and the whole network that you've all assembled. And I mean, I think in terms of autoethnography and the self, it just happens to be for me that this project kind of presented itself. Like, I've done, you know, at least a decade of research on various kinds of wireless technologies and smart systems. And kind of critiques of those things, and thinking a lot about the ways that these like techno-visions are presented. And so very much this project, it just happens that autoethnography is the best way to account for that experience. And I think moving that in methodologically, I mean, I think that we could consider it, in one way, we could consider it as a good starting point for our design research, because it really helps a designer understand what it is they care about and what it is they can observe closely and how to observe closely. Because if you're observing something in your everyday life that you normally take for granted completely, you actually have to kind of pay attention in a different way than if you're at work being assigned to go interview users, or right. So it actually creates a different way of paying attention in everyday life. So I think there are some benefits to doing it at the beginning of a research process, just to understand your own positionality and notice more deeply in your everyday life. So I've used it that way, you know, in teaching and in classroom. But I do think that there's a way also to potentially link it with futures research. And I think there, what's interesting definitely is the experiential aspect. So as we start to think about what does it mean to experience situations that are, you know, really truly different. So I think it's one way to put ourselves into those situations, and I think is to kind of draw from, you know, a wide variety of again, you know, I think the future imaginaries that are needed are kind of out there, right? So I think a lot about, yeah, what are the kind of disability rights futures that are being imagined and desired, right? And so, or what are the kind of in critical race theory, what are those futures? And then, so I don't think we need to actually spend so much time as designers trying to imagine the things, because the ideas are very widespread in art and activism in particular, about what kinds of futures we might want to, you know, live in or desire to create. But what we need to do is figure out a way to experience them. So that means we have to move them like out of the gallery or out of the, you know, out of the, say, the graphic presentation of scenarios and into kind of a real everyday life situation. And then we can experience that and then reflect on our experience, and that we learn about our own ability. So an example of that would be, you know, and I think it's kind of very trendy right now, but there's a lot of events around the future of food in which you go to an event and you essentially eat the food. So eating the food is an experience of the alternative possible future, or this, you know, a version of another reality. And I don't really think it matters if we situate things like 3,000 years in history or 10,000 years in the future. I think the point of the future framing temporally is about destabilizing the current moment. And so I don't think it actually really, I think that that's a bit overstated in the futures field, that something has to be 100 years in the future, or that's a very linear understanding of time and of progress that, again, can be very problematic because it's very much tied to the same, you know, kind of Western Enlightenment understanding of time. So what we need to do, though, is encounter new situations and experiencing them more from like a role-playing or theatrical encounter, right? So I think that's where the two can come together. I've been thinking about it a little bit like an idea called like auto futures, and my students have tried these things out in class, like where they use autoethnography, but then they also do some kind of a what if, and so I'm thinking about it. And I think Anne Burdick's work on intimate everyday futures is also very relevant. So it takes exactly what Jonathan was saying about the maybe smaller scale or specific, you know, intimate everyday, and it tries to bring it alive through story or through an event that we can experience, and then we can reflect on our ability to experience things that are really kind of destabilizing in some way. So those are my thoughts. But thank you so much for the question. It's really, you know, on the cutting edge of what we need to be thinking about.
Thank you. It's really close to our prototyping ideas, I have to say, to the prototyping idea as a concept of the summer school. So I think very interesting. Thank you for your answer.
Okay, there's many questions in the chat. Yeah. I think the last one of Mattia, Italia, I think, Laura, I think you answered to that. It was more connected to, what kind of, if this research can actually be a PhD research. And I think what you've just tell me if I'm wrong, but I think the answer is it can be a part. It can be a part that can, support or allow me to understand better the situation. And so it could be a method that I use within a larger, let's say, PhD research. I think this could be, and at the moment it is not considered a possibility. I mean, or it's rarely used, but probably it's not the PhD. It's, go ahead.
I would agree. I mean, I would just say that, yes, it's a very risky, because of our current scientific models, it's still very risky, especially in the design field. However, if you look at Black studies or critical disability studies, it's actually quite a common approach. And that's where people are really collapsing the scientific and the creative. So it's really that praxis. I wouldn't do it if I was in the design field or the HCI field and I was just starting out. I wouldn't do that as my only method. And even I don't do that as my only method. I mean, I'm able to, I can go interview people, but I can do many other kinds of research, and I have in my career. But I don't think that the knowledge that's created is useless. And I think the reason for that is because, once you have an understanding of the broad debates in the field, about whatever it is you're studying, you're able to get evidence from everyday life to make those points. It's just that strategically, you may want to add some other examples or other evidence, and just be smart about who you're trying to convince with your arguments. But that's all I have to say about it.
Jonathan, I don't know if you had the chance to read the chat. There's a question probably that you can address there.
Yeah, sure. Let's check. Yeah, I actually thought the Antonio's question about, I'll just quickly read it out. So in this philosophical perspective of more than human, what are the possible space-time scenarios of artifacts' existence? Are they related to cyclicality, linearity, or alternative time cycles? In short, what are the temporal and spatial patterns derived from these possible scenarios? So yeah, I mean, that's one of those questions that keeps me up as well. Like, I was thinking about that a lot, and one of the things I can offer in response to that is that for me the trick is to think of products as processes rather than things, and the moment you think of a product as a process rather than a thing, in a way it temporally extends it into something that happens over time. And when I saw your question, Antonio, I grabbed this off my bookshelf, which is a book, I hope that's not in reverse for you, probably is, but Timefulness. Timefulness, which is this book that says how thinking like a geologist can help save the world. So it's kind of what it does is, this book is very cool, you'd like it, Antonio. It basically takes a lot of things that we think of as fleeting and quick, like a sandwich packet or a piece of toilet paper, and it extends it across a geological timescale, and it talks about where it comes from, what it is, how it's used, what happens after it's used, and suddenly we think of the product as a process. So I think trying to bring your mind to things as processes rather than static things is an interesting thing to do, and it's something that in design, thanks to things like the circular economy, we're starting to do and we're getting better at, but it's really early days for it. Also, I've got a friend who's really kind of tied up in process philosophy, and Stefano, you'd probably be quite interested in some of those ideas, I think, as well. And so I think anything that can bring your mind to the process side of things is always valuable.
Otherwise, a black hole. Let's fold time and space.
Another way of addressing this point could be by reflecting on the dichotomy between chronological and kairotic times, in the sense that we have, let's say, the standard scientific organization of time by the way people perceive and reconfigure kind of, and also organization as well, reconfigure kairotic timescapes. So maybe we could be able to develop a certain kind of tools in order to grasp, capture, reconsider the different kind of temporalities people, groups, communities, different communities can develop from below in a certain sense.
Yeah, thank you. Stefano, I'm so happy you added there, because you speak with such clarity on the topic. A quick thing to add as well, and then move on because we've got loads of questions, but a quick thing to add is this sense of everything is circular anyway, right? And if you think about a single-use battery, right, which is one of the worst ideas ever, an object that takes 1,000 times more energy to produce than it delivers in its life, and that following its short life spends about 200 years killing everything in its vicinity. So it's one of those ideas that it's circular, but it's not it's not circulating in a way that we intended. The externalities are far greater than we anticipated. So I think the more than human context kind of interesting when we talk about circular economy, because often what we're trying to do is bring things back into a human-centered, where we can capitalize on it and we can make more money out of the material. We don't lose it, we can still profit from it. But I think if you look at a more than human emphasis to the circular economy, it gets kind of interesting, because the things you start trying to protect and preserve are not necessarily the things you can sell. But we're still talking about circularity, so there's something to add. But yeah, I'll hand it back, and we can perhaps Valentina, I don't know if you want to pick the next question, or
yeah, I was looking at the first question that was in the chat of Joanna, but I was trying to understand, Joanna, if you can maybe jump in if you want, otherwise we'll try and understand it. It's more for Laura, I think, because it has to do with AI and the relationship. There you are, Joanna. Maybe you want to rephrase it a bit just to understand better. I think I've understood, but go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking about this tension of working in a very situated local type of practice, and in relation to a topic that is so big like AI, not only because AI is everything and nothing, but also because we are talking about really vast infrastructures. So I was thinking if the modern human, or which methods of modern human design could help us to engage with this complexity without really flattening it, because from my own practice, I see always the need to clarify that I'm talking about AI agents. So when I say I'm doing design, research through design with AI, people ask me always, so what are you researching actually? What kind of interactions? And I always have to kind of pin it down to, okay, so this is an Alexa, this is a particular interaction. And I find there's a lot of tension in that, because I actually want to talk about the whole infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's why I tend to think about or use the term like AI systems, which for me includes also the hardware as well as the software, because the systems I'm talking about and even the kinds of dilemmas and problems are, there's many different explanations for why these things are occurring, how they're occurring. Some of those relate to the actual data, your actual blood sugar. So it might actually be like what you ate that causes some kind of crazy then, loop of, alerts and alarms and things. But others might be related to how you taped it on your body. And others, there's a sort of theory in a lot of the Facebook groups that you need to be very well hydrated for the system to work well. And so all of that is part of what it takes to make this AI system work. And so it's very, it's very difficult. And I think I even wonder whether anyone knows the exact answer to how it does work, right? So I think that that's something, you can call customer service 1,000 times and you'll get a lot of different answers. So there's not a clear understanding of what it means for this AI system in this situated contextual example, right? So I think that perhaps that means, I do think that in social science and maybe HCI research, we are moving towards trying to describe things as AI systems, or trying to explain that there's not a single like AI, that it is in itself very reliant on a lot of different aspects. But also maybe it is a little bit of an oxymoron to talk about situated AI just because of the amount of data that it takes. So it's really about scale. Like making these things work is about taking in lots of data. But that doesn't mean that we can't redefine what AI is. And I think Maya Ganesh's project, AI is for another, I think, or AI is another, is a different way to just kind of unpack what AI is for the development of literacy and different examples for the design field. So, but yeah, I mean, the other thought I've had as I'm writing about this is about, I don't know if you're familiar with Lucy Suchman's work on plans and situated actions, but in that example, the situated actions were typically the human interactions with the Xerox copy machine. And in this case, and why I talk about indeterminacy and uncertainty, is because the AI is behaving in strange and unexpected ways that are not clearly known in advance by the program because of all of these entanglements and reliances and interdependencies. So yeah, so I think it challenges some of that as well.
Yeah, there's a couple other questions on this, Laura, in the chat, very much on AI. I think this one of Grace, I don't know if you're there, you want to jump in, otherwise I'll read it. Have you experimented at all with the concept of bleed in LARPing? Maybe you should read it because there's it's written there, so if you recognize it. And the role that could play in auto-futures or auto-fiction.
I actually don't know about the concept of bleed, but I did participate in Control Wars. I know that Grace from that experience. So, but I don't know about the concept of bleed. So I'd be curious to learn more about it.
Sorry, I can. Sorry, it's a very specific question. So, but bleed is a concept in live action role play where you're role playing another way of being, but you're also taking some of your own personal way of being into that role play. So you're essentially performing a fiction, which I think could be interesting in this auto futures way of doing things because it is playing with a fiction. I don't know. So I thought maybe you had considered that.
Well, I can just comment, just building on my experience of Control Wars, which was an event that Grace and a number of her colleagues coordinated last summer, and it was like an online, world building game of sorts that took place over a period of 2 weeks. And I would say that in this sense of like what it means to experience or prototype in this way, there are those moments when you're playing those games or experiencing those scenarios that I do think quickly become incredibly generative in the sense that you do kind of become someone else. You are yourself, of course, and you are, tied to, some of your own politics and identities as you play. But then I think what happens, in creative work, there's that moment where kind of things change or new ideas come to mind. So we created, what I remember, we created like this whole new language for this new society that had like a new kind of stock market in which like emotions were traded. And we just we named all those things. We built that world, but it wasn't really clear from the beginning. And I'm not much of a gamer, to be honest, at all. But it's like these creative moments in which, yes, like the self, it becomes other and it kind of embodies you participate in the game really in a very embodied way. And I do think that it does allow you to experience a kind of alternative reality of sorts, So I thought it was a really nice example of what it means to do futuring work that is then, tied to the self, but also allows the experience of the other or another in some way.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to bring to this the example. Maybe some of you know the Dear Data project. I mean, it's in this discourse, about trying to auto-ethnography, but through collecting data, it connects a bit the two, and still, again, connected to everyday life, and then probably reflecting on the futures. It's not really a role playing, but I guess it could be then interpreted as such. Jonathan, do you want to comment the links that you put there in the chat? Just so I saw you put some links.
Oh, all I was doing was a bit of administration. I was just kind of, the odd book name got dropped, so I thought I'd share a link to the publisher's website so you could see if anyone was interested, that's all. But I did want to mention, I think Chiara dropped a question in, you know, following Iona's questions, what are the key questions designers should ask when designing wearable technologies for self-tracking, being self-tracking an intimate and personalized experience? So again, Laura, I'm sure you've got thoughts on this as well, but for me, my thinking is about the word technology and whether the question, I think the question you should be asking is, if you're interested in tracking or understanding more about your body, I think there's a techno-deterministic way of just assuming that's, you know, people tend to assume that means a digital device connected to the cloud. I mean, I think we're in that place now, aren't we? And sure, that's a thing. But I also think there's a more interesting space almost where you start to think, well, what are the different ways of understanding what my body's doing, and how can designed objects and experiences help me to do that? And it may be that the outcome is a digital artifact, but I think when you first go through more essential fundamental ways of noticing your body and understanding how materials and systems can help you do that, you may then approach the design of a digital scenario in a very different way. So I kind of feel like the scope has been narrowed far too much, far too quickly in that space, and so we need to sort of reopen it a bit.
Yeah, what I also like of your research, Laura, is that you're not doing it to make it better, to make I mean, you're not, you know, it's not an iteration about the technology itself, but it's a reflection on the relationship between the two, which I find interesting. So it's not about, you know, giving back feedback to the company on making it better as a device, but it's a deeper reflection on the relationship between humans and these technologies.
Yeah, it's exactly the perspective of my question, as I feel that there's not just a techno-deterministic approach designers should take into consideration, as the relationship with wearable technologies and self-tracking is really deeply entering in the intimacy psychological aspects of this relationship, and designers should embrace this perspective in designing the process of designing those objects, but also in the definition of characteristics of those projects those products as well.
Yeah, I was just going to add maybe a list of some of the kind of ethical topics that come up in this project, which I didn't really talk, you know, so specifically about. I mean, I do definitely think like human autonomy and agency is still relevant, and you know, it is. Not, I don't think not about, okay, human autonomy above all else. I think it's still about a negotiation and reconfiguration, a balance, you know, I'm still, of course, writing very much in like the frame of more than human, or what it means to see yourself differently in this way. But there has to, you know, I think when we follow the techno-deterministic line of thinking, as Jonathan mentioned, which happens with, I think, a lot of wearable tech or medical devices, where it's been decided that the algorithm will solve this problem. And because it's going to be a new market, essentially, for the company to sell something that's going to be more expensive, and it's going to have new promises attached to it, and maybe it might be better for the patients or not, you know, but I think it's really important to understand where agency is being taken away and where it's being added. And I mean, I can compare two devices, one that I used, you know, 5 years ago and one that I use now, and I've had options taken away from me. So they limit my agency, they limit my ability to reconfigure my relationship with the device. And that's partially due to legal reasons. We can't just let AI become the new doctors without having the human in the loop, so to speak. So a lot of the things that sound really good on paper from an engineering perspective or from a design perspective, when you live with them in everyday life, it just takes on a completely different meaning. So I'd say definitely autonomy and agency. And then I would say trust. You know, when you feel that the device does not trust you, you know, I think it's related, of course. When the device is continually nudging you to do something that you know that you don't need to do at that moment. So that's another one. Definitely, I think the whole idea of like the way the software industry sort of, the idea is like you ship the technology as soon as it's like at the minimum viable product. And so basically, I think, you know, another way to think about this is that I've been stuck for 4 years with a minimum viable product, you know, kind of running my life, right? And clearly the next version is promised to solve some of the issues that were identified in this, but there's a level of disturbance and harm. And, you know, I mentioned like a bunch of consequences around that if you're stuck with it for 4 years, it means something very different than if you can buy a different phone, you know, the next 6 months later or something, right? So what it means for those consequences is very different depending on what you're designing. And then there are a whole bunch of interoperability and IP issues. So if you could purchase items from different companies and allow them to work together, which of course no company wants to do because they want to control all aspects of the system, right? So that they can sell all aspects of the system. And so, you know, I mean, these are, if someone were to want to do, you know, research into specific ethical or political questions, like any of those would just be super rich and super interesting. And I can only touch on them, you know, more superficially in some sense, or briefly with respect to this one case.
I have many people in line here. Stefano, you shared something, and then Erin Claire, if you want to jump in as well.
I was just following on to say, I think there's the AI, but there's also the socio-political legal system around. I read an article only yesterday about CPAP machines that insurance companies had provided using that data to decide if you were a sufficiently compliant patient, and then that affecting your coverage and your cost for health insurance.
Okay, I don't see. I think we've covered the questions in the chat. If we haven't, please, if I've lost one, because it started going quite fast. So I think Laura just answered to Joanna's, right, as well.
So I want to thank also Valentina and Stefano as our discussant today. Great job. Thank you for this smooth transition between the speeches and the conversation, the discussion after. I think that thanks to you guys, we have opened very many tracks for reflections for students, not just for the sake of the prototyping experience we are asking them this week, but in general for the general audience in relation to our experience as human beings in the contemporary condition, in the relation with technology, digital technologies, and also offering reflections for understanding our agency as citizen. So in the reflecting on the dimension, the individual dimension and individual responsibility that we have for the community as well. And in particular, reflections helpful for our PhD students within their research. I feel that today and yesterday are very, very well connected, as we have been scouting, browsing, digging into very many perspectives of a multifaceted topic. So it's definitely not an ending for this conversation. We hope that beyond the summer school, we'll have the opportunity in other context to continue talk with you guys about all this, and follow also the different individual researches, and in particular, Laura's, your experience with your device to see how it goes and how the relationship grows. So thank you very much for your time, for your contribution, and for sharing everything
Thank you so
with us. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.